everybody. Welcome back to Pagan's Witchy Corner. My name is Pagan, and today I'm joined by a very awesome guest, and that is Ben Stimpson. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly.
You did,
And
yes.
yay! Ben is the author of Ancestral Whispers, a guide to building ancestral veneration practices. The book is currently not out yet, but it is available for pre-order. The book does come out on September 8th, 2023. So, Ben, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I've been looking forward to coming on. Thank you.
I'm so glad you're here. The book was awesome. It was so had so much information packed into such I when I read it I was like there's only like 272 pages and there's so much information and I'm only like in chapter 5. What?
I was shocked when I got the physical copy. I was like, "Look at this little puny little thing," but no, it definitely packs a punch, and I yeah, it's a weird sort of timey wimey, bigger on the inside than it is on the outside kind of thing.
I love the Doctor Who reference. Yes, absolutely. We are Whovians around these parts. So I absolutely loved how much history you brought into the book. There was so much history that I didn't realize that. I mean, I knew of some of the historical practices with ancestor veneration and all of that, but
Mhm.
there was so much that you brought into it. Where did you begin the research? Because like it was so
Of
vast and so
course.
big.
No, of course. Well, in truth, this book really is a culmination of one of my major interests. I've been studying religion and spirituality since I was a teenager, and I actually did a lot of university credits in different religious traditions. I am currently completing my BA that I started over a decade ago, with a focus in religious studies and medieval studies. So
Hmm.
I have a large background in that. But particularly, I found when I knew what to look for, that made it easier for me to then look and start to bring in a lot of the examples. And it was important for me to give a lot of examples in this because the target audience of this book comes from a cultural space of not knowing what to do. And so giving really concrete examples to break down and exemplify the points I was making was very important. But I also know a lot of people. I'm really connected with people from a lot of diverse backgrounds. And so I had a lot of intimate and personal relationships I could rely on to ask and to connect with. And so when I was writing this book, it took me 8 months, and then with the editing process, 2.5 years to get this finalized form. So I had a lot of opportunity to kind of keep things in mind.
Hmm.
And so really that was my process in researching it is relying on my social network, relying on my past education, and also watching a lot of documentaries, which was the fun part.
I bet that was really fun. And it really does pack a punch and it does kind of span, I would say, almost a full global interest of everything because there wasn't a whole lot that you missed, I would say, in terms of the global community in some
Thank
way.
you. I really
It
appreciate that. Thank you.
You're very welcome. It bridged such a large gap, which was really nice, and kind of seeing all those different tidbits throughout the book made it very easy to kind of look at it from different perspectives, which was really awesome. So, in terms of your ancestral practices, where would you say that yours, I guess you could say, where did they begin for you?
Of course. So I heavily started working with ancestors in a spiritual context. Only about 5 or 6, 7 years ago, I started to work with a Lukumi ile. So Lukumi is an Afro-Cuban tradition. It's commonly called Santeria, but that's not the term that insiders use for it. And I met a priest of that tradition who, ironically, I had met 20 years before when I was a kid at a sci-fi convention. He was working at a sci-fi convention, and I remember vividly meeting him, but I didn't know who he was or whatever. So when I caught up with him again, he was initiated into that tradition, And ancestor work in many African traditions is foundational. It is one of the cornerstones and foundations that most of the other traditions within those religions are built off of. And so I heavily started working with my ancestors. Ancestry has always been, and ancestors have always been a big part of my life because as an immigrant, all of my ancestors are in another country. Their
Hmm.
physical remains are in another country. Their stories are in another country. I'm originally from the UK. And so living and growing up in Canada, there was no context of our family in this place. Our context was in another place. And so ancestor work was very heavily picked up with and connected to relationship with that with home. So I would say that working with the ancestors in story form has been a big part of my life for a very long time, but as a spiritual tradition, it's only been the past few years. And that's really where the book and the genesis comes from. Is I saw a gap and a need in the pagan community, because there wasn't a lot written about ancestors. There were maybe, I would say, probably in the past 20 years, the books on ancestor work, particularly for white people, particularly for the pagan community, particularly for Westerners, can fit on one small bookcase.
Yes.
Majority of the ancestor is true, right? Majority of the books that are on ancestor work are related to BIPOC and non-Western traditions, right? And
Hmm.
that's important. There's a reason for that because those cultures and those traditions have it as a natural and very vivid part of the tradition. Westerners have been removed from a lot of our ancestral traditions, and particularly Western pagans have been disconnected from those traditions because most of those traditions come from a Christian cultural worldview, right? So there can be a strange relationship between Western pagans and their Christian ancestors. But most of the reconstructed pagan traditions that are out there don't have those ancestral pieces because we don't have those ancient pagan ancestral traditions, because most of those cultures were oral traditions that were broken. And so there's a big disconnect, there's big unsurety about what to do. And so I wrote this book with that understanding of bringing in relationship and building relationship with ancestors using the cultural context we find ourselves now, but also looking at worldview, building a tradition and building and practices based on worldview. And that's a huge part of the book. The first part is all about worldview.
Hmm.
How do you conceptualize life? How do you conceptualize death? How do you conceptualize the ancestors? Can you expand that definition of ancestors? And then the second half of the book is on ritual and on all the various forms of a lived spiritual practice, and then how ancestor work can come into that. So,
That
yeah,
was
wow, that is a lot.
it is a lot, but it
That
was a
is a lot.
beautiful encapsule of what your book really does entail. And I also really particularly enjoyed the aspects in your book, especially in the beginning, where you
Mhm.
talk about all of the different outlooks of death in terms of world
Yes.
cultures. And that was
Hmm.
something that, you know, as growing up in America, of course, we're very
Yes.
disconnected from death. We're obsessed with it, but we're
Hmm.
very disconnected
Totally.
from it. So,
Well, that's where that obsession comes from.
right.
That's where that obsession comes from, right? It's the same like in Japanese culture. They are obsessed with sex because sexuality is such a repressed part of their culture,
Hmm.
right? Whenever you find a culture that is repressive of a certain thing, you will find the counterculture is huge around that thing. It's funny. It's interesting.
It is very interesting to kind of see how that works. And I
Mhm.
think that your book is going to make such a huge impact, especially in the pagan community,
Thank you.
because it does bridge kind of like you were saying, all those world gaps and everything
Mm,
else, but it also allows people to kind of decide where they want to take their own practice now that they're like, oh, I have been
really.
shown all these different avenues that could be taken.
Hmm.
And obviously, whatever avenue you choose, whoever's listening to this, make sure that you're doing it with respect, obviously, but
Hmm. Hmm.
and you do bridge those kind of things as well about, cultural appropriation and how all that works. So
Yes,
I think that it's going to be
absolutely.
a beautiful kind of introduction into where to really begin with working with your ancestors. Because we're kind of like, you
Absolutely.
should work with your ancestors. Cool. How do I do that? Can you
Do I
tell
do
me?
that? Right. Yeah. Well, but this is part of the issue. A lot of Western pagans come from a cultural background which is Christian, which is orthodox, right? There's
Hmm.
orthoprax. There are right beliefs and right ways of doing something, or there's heresy, right? And so I think that mindset often is brought into our traditions, um, and we ask ourselves that same question. Well, what do I do? All of the books that are on like Witchcraft 101, they all give you something to do, which is fine for when you're starting out, but eventually you have to get to a place where you have to own your own tradition and own your own practices, and that practices and those traditions have to come naturally and organically from how you're viewing the world, which is, I think, again, that really important piece that often gets missing. We focus so much on the doing in Western paganism, we don't necessarily think about all of the beliefs behind it.
Hmm.
And I think there's reasons for that, but I think it's also the one has to be in relationship to the other, and vice versa. So I really hope that it comes across in the book.
It does
That
very well.
Oh, good, okay, good, really good,
It
good.
does come across very well, and you do paint that picture very beautifully. And I want to talk a little bit about, because I would like to hear, obviously audibly, about kind of your thoughts on it. One of the sections in the book that really stuck out for me was the practice of bringing in kind of almost what you would call otherkin, or other types of spirits that aren't descendant ancestors, and
Yes.
even people of a fictional background that have influenced your life. Kind
Yes.
of, where did
Mhm.
that kind of come about, and what are your thoughts on helping people kind of figure out more about that, obviously, without,
Totally.
going deep
So
into the
that
book.
is
If you want to know more, read the book. But
so it is one of my favorite aspects of the book, and it is something that a lot of the other podcasters who I've been talking to have been really interested in. I wish that I could claim that it was my own idea, but it was inspired by several others. It was inspired by the other cultures that I was reading about. It was inspired by the work of a anthropologist down. Well, she's a physicist. She's kind of an all over thing. But there's Dr. Lynn Kelly down in Australia, and she put out a couple of books on the power of story, and particularly in the use of memory technologies in various oral cultures around the world, in order to maintain vast amounts of information within an oral context. So these are cultures that don't write anything down. They don't have a written language. And what's been proven is that in a lot of these cultures, huge amounts of information is encoded into things like the landscape, is encoded through ritual and spiritual practices, um, uh, as memory triggers for maintaining these memory systems. And so I was really, really interested in that. And one of the cultures that she spoke about was the Kachinas in among the Hopi and the Zuni
hmm.
peoples of the Midwest, of the West.
Hmm.
I don't know the US that well, so it's very in the
I
desert
I
down
know
there,
it
right?
very well.
Yes.
The Kachina, the Hopi region, and like the Kachinas, where you would find a lot of those, is going to be the west and southwest of the United States, particularly like New Mexico, Arizona, the Four Corners kind of areas.
Mm,
My where I grew up was in Taos, and so
okay.
we were very good friends with lots of people of the tribe there. And
Oh, wonderful.
the I got to learn the stories of the Kachinas firsthand from them, which was really
Yes.
cool, and we had several of them in our
Oh, that's
house
beautiful.
that were gifted to us. So yeah, we got to
Oh,
learn all
love
about the
it.
Kachinas, and it was really
I love
interesting.
it.
When I was growing up, I was like, they're terrifying looking. Like, the little Kachina dolls are actually very terrifying looking, but they have this, presence and this spiritualism about them that you have to learn about to make them less terrifying. So,
Completely.
yeah, it's a very
Completely.
interesting thing, and I was like, "I know about those," when I was reading the book. It was really
Right?
fun.
Well, and I mean, I've been aware of them because my interests are vast, right? But you can only go so deep when your interests are vast. So I was aware of them, but I didn't really look too deeply into them. But the way that she framed her in her book was that they are not seen as gods in the Western European sense, but they're also not just fictional characters either. They are mythological ancestors. They are folk ancestors that each symbolize a particular, um, uh, they symbolize particular parts of the culture,
Hmm.
but they're more than just symbolic representations. They are spirits in their own right. They are embodiments. They are all of these different things. But then, but and so the Kachina dolls, each one of them is not it's not just a doll. It is a piece. At least this is how Dr. Kelly was framing it. They are they are a document to be read. The symbols, all of the aspects of these individual dolls, inform you about the Kachina and how the embodiment of that Kachina, which is a part of the culture, the lesson, all of these things. Um, and so children learn with these dolls first in preparation for then encountering the Kachinas in dances when they come into, and especially coming from an ATR background myself, you know, spirit possession is not something that I'm averse to, and it's something that I've experienced. Um, the idea of the spirit possessing individual dancers to then embody those kachinas within those dances, it becomes a sacred document that the whole tribe and the whole community is able to read and engage with. And so I started to think about that idea for myself. Well, these are a lot of the kachinas are ancestral. They're considered ancestral to the community. And that relationship is ancestral. I started to think about, okay, well, what are some of the characters in my life that I have had a relationship with that have meant something to me? And that can be my biological ancestors. That can be my affinity ancestors, those people and individuals who have contributed to my places of study or whatnot. But then when I looked at the relationship there, I thought, okay, well, what is the difference between me relating to a dead great great grandfather and his story, and me relating to an affinity ancestor from, say, the queer community who contributed to the rights that I now enjoy and fought for the rights that I now enjoy? What is the difference between me relating to them through those stories of those individuals and me relating to the stories of a fictional character? They've both all of them have impacted who I am, all of them inform how I walk in the world. And so ancestor work then shifts from honoring a particular form of ancestor because of a particular biological relationship to then expanding that to look at relationships broadly. And so in that way, then ancestor work as a category merges with ancestor work, it merges with spirit work, merges with identity work, merges with deity work, because oftentimes I think a lot of the deities that we work with are we connect with their stories in some way. So I started to then expand that out, and I thought, okay, there's a lot going on here. It all comes down to relationship, and so the reality of the Kachinas um, doesn't matter. It
Hmm.
isn't then about if the Kachinas or the spirits or the Orishas or whatever are real, because their impact is real, right? Now, myself, I understand spirits as being independent and real forces in the world. I come from an animist perspective, but I know not all pagans do. I
Hmm.
know there's a lot of pagans who come to these traditions through that archetypal lens more, but the relationship is still the same. The impact is still the same. So
Right.
that's kind of how then that really informed then those two chapters, and I hope that that comes true. But that really was kind of what brought me and put me onto this. And then when I started to see how other cultures around the world related to the stories of their spirits, it seemed to be in a very similar way. And I tried to privilege as much as I could the voices of people from those communities. The trouble with a lot of marginalized communities and like cultures outside of a Western world, particularly trying to operate in English, is that often those cultures are needing to translate really untranslatable forms of understanding into English using loaded words like gods, angels, spirits, and blah, 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 right? So then
Right.
you have, and there's issues. So it's kind of peeling behind that, trying to get a sense of it, but bringing it and then into the idea of relationships. So that was actually half the major research, was really trying to, are you actually saying that in that sense, or are you, is there more to this that needs to have more cultural understanding? So really, it was trying to gain more of a cultural understanding of some of these examples in as much way that I could, being an outsider to those traditions.
I think a lot of it kind of, if you're new to it and you're trying to figure out like, well, what does that mean for me? Like, where do I think that whatever it takes, whatever ancestor, deity, otherkin spirit, whatever you want to call it,
Mm,
that, you are having that connection with, um, I think that a lot of it boils down to, yes, it may not seem quote unquote real to some folks or even
mhm,
folks on the
mhm.
outside, but it's your belief that brings it into reality. And the belief that brings it into your reality and allows it to help you grow or be a better human, be a better witch, whatever it may be, that allows you to say that this is influencing me in a positive way. Obviously, if it's influencing you in a negative way, you should probably take a second look at that.
That's exactly.
That's not exactly
Yes.
how that's supposed to work. But if that's what's happening, um, you know, take everything with a grain of salt. And I love how in your book you also mention that not all ancestors have to be, you know, brought into your life because some are not
Mm,
good. Some have done some
this is
terrible
so true.
things that you're like, I really don't identify with that. And then I also like how you're like, you know what? The ones that were supposed to be so terrible and so bad, and I'm not talking about the ones that were like colonizers and horrible human beings. We're not talking about those ones. We're talking about the ones that were maybe put to death because they were the rebels of society, and but because they were basically fighting the system. And it's like, well, if you
Mm.
identify with that, maybe that's somebody that you should kind of talk to and see if they would be a beneficial ancestor to bring into your practice. So
Absolutely.
yeah, it was
Absolutely.
beautifully written the way you put it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That is another key question, right? How do you work with ancestors who you have problems with, who historically were not great people? This is the trouble with, and I think this needs to be said. This is the trouble with Westerners and ancestor work, is that oftentimes how we see history is based upon a narrative of history. And some narratives are very, very close to what actually happened, right? The Holocaust happened. That is not debatable. And
Mm-hmm.
the people who were involved in the Holocaust, there's a lot of focus on that. But then when you think of, I was just having a conversation before with somebody else about this. When you think about, like the outliers, the black sheep, right? How connected are you to that story? If you've grown up in a context in a family where you've been told that so and so great uncle was a horrible human being and that we don't talk about them, then you're not likely to talk about them. So I think it depends on the individual ancestor. I think it depends on your relationship with them too. And I also think it depends on what your goal is. I think that a danger with ignoring ancestors is that we don't then fully understand the context that we live in now and those aspects that may have originated with those ancestors. By understanding those ancestors fuller,
Mm-hmm.
we understand that context, but we have to actually acknowledge that they exist. There's a lot of people in the South, for example, and in the United States and Canada too, who don't want to admit that their ancestors were slave owners.
Mm-hmm.
But what damage do we do by ignoring that history? I think there's also another piece here about the idea of ancestral healing. And Dr. Daniel Four talks a lot about this in his book about ancestral healing, which is fantastic. And he talks about the idea of healing by putting things into context, healing by taking the weight off of those ancestors, but also healing by, again, putting up those strong boundaries. It depends on the ancestor, right? If you have an ancestor who is irreconcilable, then putting appropriate boundaries around that individual. If you have an ancestor who was irreconcilable when they were alive, checking in to see where they're at now. Because just as we, I mean, I'm certainly not an angel, right? I've done some terrible things in my life as well. I think all of us have. In the context of that time of our lives, we need to have the capacity to be able to grow.
Hmm.
And I think that with ancestral work, part of the responsibility is conferring that idea that even in death, ancestors are able to grow. Dangerous ones are the ones that don't grow. And that's where I think people need to become aware and conscious of that. The ones that never moved past where they were in their life, that continue to view the world in a static form, are the dangerous ones. In many traditions, many societies, ghosts that become monstrous and individuals who become transformed into monsters are often the ones that can't move past the pain, the hurt,
Hmm.
or the ego that they were stuck in. And then they become unhuman and they become a danger to society. At that point, then the ancestral work is going to the collective and allowing the collective to deal with those individuals, right? So it's a huge amount of thing, but I think that it again it depends on individual relationships. Sometimes, as and don't misquote me on this, but sometimes individuals who held slaves 300 years ago were not bad people, but they were engaging in a cultural institution that was inherently bad, right?
Hmm.
And we need to then understand that we don't condone their engaging with that cultural institution, but the responsibility piece is then to make sure that that cultural institution of slavery does not show up in our world now. We also root out all of the evils of that institution as they show up now, such as understanding that the modern industrial complex around imprisonment is a modern form of that same mindset, right?
Yes. So,
Yeah.
you know,
So
I think I want to double check just to make sure that I'm understanding. And I think what you're trying to say here is that a part of the ancestral work, especially with those problematic, ancestors, and part of their healing is almost holding them to accountability for
yes,
their actions
exactly.
and making sure that they understand, hey, this was not a wise decision or a good behavior. You shouldn't have done this. This is not acceptable in human
Hmm.
evolution. We don't do this anymore.
Hmm.
So that's basically kind of what you're saying, just to confirm with my own brain to make
Very
sure
much
that's
so.
correct.
Yes,
Okay.
you hold them to accountability, but you also, part of that accountability is understanding what part you're holding on to now. So you've grown up, you exist in in a cultural context existing now that is linked to all of the other cultural contexts that go into the past. And so understanding how the context that those particular ancestors were part of and perpetuated, understanding what parts of those still exist for your cultural context now and changing them. So then it's not just I'm going to scapegoat you as a bad person and just wipe my hands clean because you were the bad one, you're the bad slaveholder in that case, right?
Hmm.
Understanding that you're descended from that person and making them positive, as positive as you can, intentional changes to the legacy going forward. But that being said, in 200 years' time, your ancestors may look back on, our descendants, I should say, may look back on our time now as being deeply flawed. We're all horrible people. It depends on that narrative, right?
Right.
So there's a lot of moving parts here. There's a lot of moving parts here. But I guess to summarize it, I would say it's about that relationship. And a very key piece here is that you don't have to have relationship with anybody. You don't have to.
No, you don't. You
You
can say,
don't.
"No, I'm not part of that."
Yep. Exactly.
And I
Right.
think also part of for me when it comes to ancestral work is also understanding the history behind
Yes.
everything and the behaviors
Mhm.
and all of that. And obviously you talk about this in your book as well, that understanding the history of where we come from is just as important as understanding where we are now. And
Totally.
I think that especially here in America, we're trying very well. I'm not trying, but there are individuals in my country who are very much trying to say that part of history doesn't exist. We don't talk about that part of history. And I think that there's
Very much so.
a very bad narrative that comes with that. And because that's kind of just squashing like a whole generation, a whole group of people under the rug and saying, you didn't matter, you don't exist because of X, Y, and Z. And a lot of times this
Yes.
happens, unfortunately, with people of color. And we don't, that's not good for them. And it's not good for us to not know everybody's history and know where everybody came from and understand it. You don't have to know every detail, but understanding is such a huge part of, I would say, paganism as a whole, not
Totally.
just
Mhm.
ancestral work.
I would say, yes, spirituality as a whole is about understanding, and it's about relationship too. We can understand something while not having a relationship with it, but I think that true understanding comes from relationship. When we when we when we see ourselves in relationship with other, that other becomes friend, that other becomes family, that other becomes community, right? And as soon as that happens, it's no longer an us versus them. It's a we, right? And it
Hmm.
becomes very difficult to marginalize when you see other as we and not you, right?
Yeah, it's so much better to be the we than the us versus them kind of thing.
Exactly.
Exactly the best way. So we are
Yeah.
just about out of time, but what first of all, a couple of questions. Do
Yes,
you have a second book planned? And if
I
so,
do.
can you tease about it? If not, that's totally cool. Like we understand the secrets of book writing. That
Of
happens.
course, yes.
And question
Well,
two is obviously do you have any book signings planned?
so, first question, yes, I do. I am working on it right now. It's an expansion of what I've already started with the ancestral work.
Oh, nice.
I'm looking now. So in Lukumi we have a saying, ancestors beneath us, spirits around us, and God above us. And so I'm kind of planning I can't talk too much about it, but I am planning a book similar style, but focused on kind of spirit work and working with landscape and working with kind of the other figures around us. Um, so that one, I'm still plugging away with it. I don't have many details for that. The second one is for book signings. So I unfortunately don't have access to moving to coming down to the states very much.
That's fair.
But what I'm yes, um, I come from a country that fits within California. Like that's how massive the states are, right? So, but if anybody's listening to this up in Ontario, Canada, I'm going to be having my official book launch on September 30th at Wordsworth Books in Kitchener, in Waterloo, Ontario. And I also will be having a release on September 8th on my Facebook page, on my socials. So people are welcome to come and hang out there with me. For book signings, what I'm planning on doing, I just have to figure out how. Other authors have done it, and I don't know how yet. But if people are interested in a book plate, which is the sticker that people can put into the front cover, I'm going to try and get those available through my website or through Llewellyn, and sign those. So then people will have signed something that they can put into the book. So I just have to figure out how to do that.
That'll be super cool. Now, where can you said obviously you have a Facebook page. Where else on social media can people connect with you?
Of course. So, benstimpson.com is my main website that has all my social links on it. And do please go and like some of my social links if you enjoyed listening to this. It really does give a good confidence boost for authors when you do that. It really does, doesn't it? I know you know this with Instagram. I'm also on Instagram. I'm also on Goodreads. I do a podcast myself as well. So that's on YouTube. I have a lot of content on YouTube as well. And most of them are at Ben Stimpson Author. So most of those are the same, but you can just go to my website and find all of those.
Perfect. And all those links, including the book link and social links and everything, will all be listed in the show description. Ben, this was wonderful. It was such a great
I really enjoyed
conversation,
this. Thank
and
you.
we will have to do it again very, very soon, even if it's just
I'm always
talking
open.
more about ancestral work. And I would also love to talk to you about death work and see your thoughts on that as well. So
Of course,
we might have to
definitely.
come back and do that. That'll be a good time. But everybody who's been
Okay.
listening, thank you so much for joining us. Take care of yourselves, be kind to each other, and stay safe. We'll talk to you very soon. Bye bye, everyone.